When it comes to foreign policy, Reagan's priorities really lie in the end of the Cold War and rising issues with the Middle East. If you recall from our discussion on Nixon, we've been gradually working towards de-escalation or détente with the Soviet Union through limitation of our nuclear arsenals since the early 70s. Reagan's presidency continues this focus as he meets with Soviet leadership to try and bring about an end to the Cold War entirely. At the same time, though, he faces tensions in the Middle East and international scandal. Following in the footsteps of pretty much all other modern presidents, loosely used here, Reagan names his foreign policy after himself, Reagan Doctrine. So think Truman Doctrine, Eisenhower Doctrine, etc. And just like all of our Cold War presidents, it's mainly centered on the idea of communism. Shocking, I know. In what's come to be known as the Evil Empire speech, Reagan explains that the Soviet Union, as a communist nation, will always seek to spread communism. That's literally how communism works. And then in the second paragraph here, he really dives into what we already know is his very conservative Christian rhetoric, saying that Americans should pray that the communists will find God, which is really an interesting thing for us historically because we know that in the United States, historically speaking, Americans equate Christianity with democratic ideals. So if the Soviet communists are missing democracy, as communists would be, then they, by default, must also be missing Christianity. Those two things can't exist together. One can't be a Christian communist by this logic. And so Reagan says we should pray for them to find God, but until they do, it's our duty to treat them as, quote, the focus of evil in the modern world, which really is very strong language to use against a nation that we've been trying to walk back our Cold War with for the last decade or so. But Reagan here is trying to appeal to his base. He's trying to appear to be tough on the world stage, while also appearing to be the utmost conservative evangelical. And so this speech essentially is his ticket to doing whatever he feels is necessary to get that job done in the name of democracy. The vast majority of his more tangible, actionable plan here is centered on the idea of defense. He wants to essentially double the US defense budget in order to show the world that they essentially don't want to mess with us. But instead of doing this through things like offensive weapons, like the idea of brinkmanship that we had before, we're going to do this through defensive weapons this time. The big plan for this is going to be what's called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is essentially a web of satellites and other orbiting devices in space that can more or less shoot down a nuclear missile coming to attack the US, which sounds cool and all, but the problem is that this really just doesn't exist, the technology that is, and scientists essentially tell Reagan as much. But people get wind of this kind of outrageous idea and they sort of mockingly refer to it as Star Wars because the movie had just come out, and really that's pretty much exactly what this sounds like. It's like something you'd see in Star Wars with the lasers shooting out and blowing up a nuclear weapon heading for the United States. And so the Department of Defense starts working on all kinds of other defensive weapon systems, but this particular one is just sort of out of reach for now. Nevertheless, though, the general idea and image that we're going for here is essentially the same as big stick policy from Roosevelt's presidency. Reagan is going to build up the military in terms of boots on the ground people and our defensive systems, which in theory could become offensive systems, but he doesn't want to use them. The idea, though, is that he's telling the rest of the world that if they create problems for him, he will use them, though. He spent all of this money on them, and he's told his people that the USSR is the personification of modern evil, so if he needs to hit the switch, he's ready to do that. The other major part of this plan is that Reagan wants to try and lend U.S. resources to governments and groups that are actively trying to combat communism. So essentially, if it's easier to help other people fight communism rather than send in our own people, he'd like to do that. That's going to be important in a minute. It's really not long into his presidency that Reagan does end up having to deploy troops, which I want to point out no president ever wants to do. Reagan and other presidents make a big show about being willing to send troops all over the place because half their job is about posturing. But at the end of the day, not a single president is happy about deploying troops anywhere, even for a short while. Because at the end of the day, they're responsible for those men and women. And when things go wrong and people die, they're responsible for that too. This is especially the case when presidents have to deploy troops for reasons that they can't tell American people about, and then troops die or things go wrong and they can't disclose why. That's incredibly taxing on a person psychologically. But in any case, Reagan deploys troops to Lebanon in 1982 as peacekeepers, intermediaries, essentially, because Israel had invaded the country to track down a group called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO. Remember that Israel and Palestine are really not very friendly, to put it lightly, because they occupy the same geographic area which both claim as rightfully theirs. In theory, there was a time before World War II when these geographic issues could have been sorted out in a way that would have worked for both groups, but Britain and the US stepped in and messed it up for pretty much everyone. But in any case, the US sends in these troops to keep the peace because Israel isn't really welcome in Lebanon, but they're looking for the PLO, and the US doesn't want this to turn into yet another war in the Middle East because remember the last one led to the oil embargo for us. And while our troops are there, the barracks they're staying in is bombed and over 400 Marines are killed. Now, Reagan could have chosen to send in more troops in order to track down the bombers and wage a war and all kinds of other things, but he doesn't. He brings the rest of the troops home. Part of this decision had to do with the fact that Reagan's response was to use airstrikes in retaliation rather than men on the ground, but a lot of it had to do with the fact that Congress wouldn't authorize him to send more men. Remember, the War Powers Act says that the president has 30 days with troops before getting further approval from Congress or a declaration of war. In this case, he had neither, so he opened up an official investigation into the bombing, conducted counterstrikes as necessary, and filed civil suits against the governments involved, like Iran. But this is at least one example of the War Powers Act, relatively new at this point, working as it was intended. One of the more complicated foreign policy issues, and I really do mean issues, of the Reagan administration was the Iran-Contra affair. Today we know this as essentially the biggest scandal of the Reagan administration. What it started off as, though, was Reagan's attempt to solve two foreign policy nightmares at once. So here are the problems. Problem number one, Reagan wanted to support an anti-communist group in Nicaragua called the Contras in an uprising against their government. In theory, this is cool. In practicality, this is illegal because the Contras were funded primarily by cocaine money. And so Congress had passed a law saying pretty specifically that the US government couldn't support them. After all, we were still fighting this whole war on drugs thing, so that would look incredibly bad. Problem number two, Reagan wants to free some American hostages that are being held by Iranian terrorists in Lebanon. These were 7 people total that were a mixture of contractors and diplomats. Which brings us to our solutions, both of which were incredibly sketchy in terms of legality. So solution number one, the US was technically enforcing an embargo against Iran after the original Iran hostage crisis from the Carter administration, the one that lasted over a year, if you recall. So in theory, we're not supposed to be trading with them at all, but that's not really convenient here because Reagan is told that Iran would be totally willing to give our hostages back if he'd sell them some weapons. So solution, Reagan uses the CIA to secretly sell weapons to Iran, and since this is done essentially off the books, not technically, but it's different auditing, it means that solution number two, they then use some of that money from the weapon sale to give to the Contras, which if you recall from literally a few seconds ago, is definitely illegal. But because the amount of money given in exchange for the weapons isn't coming from the congressional budget, it's not exactly easy to track. And so it's not like Congress looks at their own budget spreadsheets and notices that $18 million has vanished or been skimmed off the top somewhere. It's not until the Attorney General launches an investigation into the missing money that anyone really notices, and even then, it wasn't until a Lebanese newspaper reported on the story. And at that point, a member of the National Security Council, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, comes forward as essentially the fall guy for everything. When asked about what Reagan knew about the plan, he said he assumed that he was aware, but never actually directly implicated Reagan in anything. When directly asked about it, Reagan responded, "I do not recall." Which honestly is really genius on his part because nobody can definitively prove that or not. And at worst, it makes him look like a super old man, which people had already attacked him for during his re-election campaign, so it's not like it's ridiculous to think that maybe he wouldn't recall. And if he's looking at potential for impeachment over something that's totally illegal versus looking old, he's obviously going to just take the personality hit. Because at this point, he's been comfortably reelected. He doesn't care. Plus, he's got a fall guy who's already admitted that he did the thing. So as long as they don't have any actual proof tying him to it, he's good. And that's exactly what happens. So, the end of the Iran Contra hearings ends just a few months before one of Reagan's most iconic speeches as president. In June 1987, he stood at the Brandenburg Gate and demanded, "Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." 2 years later, the people of the Soviet Union did just that. On November 9th, 1989, a group of reporters was told that the East German officials would be loosening restrictions on travel between the two sections of Berlin. In reality, the restrictions were meant to be lifted the following day, but the official reading the note off to the group didn't realize this as he shuffled through his notes, and so everyone listening in assumed that the order was immediate. So logically, people started arriving at the gates and guards were totally unprepared, and without instructions about if they were supposed to fire on the people or not, especially given the size of the crowds, commanding officers gave the order to just open the gates. And so on that evening, floods of Berliners flooded through the gates of the Berlin Wall and then proceeded to chip away at it with hammers and pickaxes to take the wall down for good. The fall of the Berlin Wall was just one step towards ending the Cold War, aspects of which we're still arguably fighting today. While our relationship with the Soviet Union is certainly more open than it once was, we're now engaged in similar battles over domination of the nuclear sphere with countries like Iran, North Korea, and even China. And in each of our interactions with these nations, discussions about weapons capabilities and arsenal strength are never divorced from discussions of democratic ideals, political autonomy, and America's history of expansionism and posturing on the global stage.